Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
My pleasure to be on.
We are looking at part 3 of our series on concubinage, Dr. Shabir. And Dr. Shabir, I think this time I want to look at what are the apologetic sort of discourses that Muslim scholars have engaged in? Because many Muslims have looked at the whole idea of concubines and have said, it wasn't that bad. They might have compared it to other contexts and said, Islam affords a lot of rights to concubines. So I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit, Dr. Shabir.
Yeah, and if you allow me, Sophia, I'd like to just say something about the word apologetic, because some people think that apologetic means that we're saying that something is bad, but we're apologizing for it. But in academia, apologetic comes from the Greek apology, which means to launch a defense. So some Muslims are defending the practice of concubinage, not for our present times, but to say that, okay, what was done was right and this was fine. And they describe it in a sort of an ideal way. And I should add here that it's not only Muslims that launch an apologetic for concubinage in the past, but also I realized from a number of YouTube videos that this is an issue for many Christians as well. One can find many YouTube videos in which Christians are trying to explain why concubinage was practiced by some of the biblical patriarchs. Of course, for Christians, it's a lesser problem because in the New Testament, there is no representation of Jesus being married to begin with, and there is no mention that he ever had a concubine. So whether or not he was married, this is still an open question for some scholars. Like Anthony LaDon, for example, wrote a book entitled Wife of Jesus with a question mark. And so he thinks that it's possible that Jesus may have been married, but no mention is ever made of Jesus having slaves or having a concubine. It looks like he did not have much property because he's reported as saying, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. But in the New Testament, slavery is still a reality. And some people may have owned slaves, not may have, but definitely owned slaves. We can see that with Paul saying, doesn't matter whether you're a slave or free. And if you're a slave, don't, try to become free. And if you're free, don't try to become a slave, and he cautions the runaway slave to return to his master. Mm-hmm. So there were slaves, and some of the slaves were naturally female, and among the female slaves, there would have been some who were taken as concubines by their masters. So why isn't this being condemned in the Bible? So many rise to the occasion to try to explain this. So there was some apologetic discourse there as well. And much of that discourse says, well, you know what, this was descriptive. It was what was happening at the time, but was not actually prescribed by the Bible. One might have more to say about that apologetic, but I want to now return to the Muslim defense of what was practiced in classical Islamic societies, what is reported to have been practiced by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, what was more clearly known to be in the practice of the early generations of Muslims, and how they approach this issue. Mm-hmm. So what I find, Sophia, is that often they present a sort of ideal. And they say, okay, well, this was not so bad. It wasn't even bad at all. And, they fail to look at it from the point of view of the hapless young woman who found herself as a slave and as a concubine and could do nothing about it. She didn't really have a choice to get out of that situation. So we need to look at that sort of harsher reality. But for the moment, let me just look at some of the things that such apologists bring forward, and some of which I agree with. I would say that, yes, there is a certain ideal here, which, unless it is balanced by the realities which we also need to discuss, they are actually facts that need to be brought into the whole discourse, so that we can appreciate and understand what was done, why it was done, and of course, to realize why we shouldn't be doing that today.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about what was unique in the Islamic understanding of concubines.
Yeah. So first of all, this comes under the broader umbrella of slavery. And in the Islamic context, it is widely recognized that slavery, as practiced in the earliest Islamic societies, was not like 18th century American slavery, where people can be seen in chains and people are being beaten, and the stripes from the whips are cutting into their backs and so on. So that's a different sort of reality. In the Islamic context, we are being encouraged. There is a statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to the effect that if you have a slave, then you are to feed them with food that is similar to what you're eating, clothe them with clothing that is similar to what you wear. You're not to refer to them as your slave, but you can say my boy rather than my slave. Because we are all to be slaves of God, and one is not a slave to the other. So the conception, the way in which we are told to look at slaves is actually different. We are to see them as our brothers, with the main difference that God has so arranged things that they happen to be under our power, but they're still our brothers in humanity, and sometimes even brother in the faith. If it so happens that one was taken as a slave when he happened to be a non-Muslim, but then, especially in war, as a result of a war, he's taken as a prisoner of war, but later on he converts to the religion of Islam. His master may choose to free him because he's now become a brother in the faith, or he may remain in that situation. So the status of slaves in general were improved in Islamic societies vis-a-vis what was seen in other societies. It was thought to be an act of goodwill to free the slave as a charitable deed, even as an act of penance for some sins that we commit. And when it came to female slaves who were taken as concubines by their masters, they too might be freed, and then the master may marry her. In fact, by her free consent, because now she's a free person, and she is thought to be now the possessor of the right to give a free consent. In any case, while she remained as a concubine, she could not be forced into prostitution by the express prohibition in the Quran in Surah 24, verse number 33. And that shows that people used to do this in ancient societies. They would have a concubine who would be used for the sexual pleasure of the master, plus she would be sold out or rented out, for the monetary gains of the master. But this could not happen now. She could not be sold. She could not be used as a prostitute. She was then committed to a sexual relationship only with her master, but not to somebody else. So she was not a toy to be used around. And if the master chose, he could actually marry her off to somebody else. But then that would be a permanent relationship of marriage with the other person. So she might be in a kind of a unique circumstance here where she is owned by one person, but she is the wife of another person. But the person who owned her can no longer have any sexual relationships with her because she is now committed to one person. So it's as if this concubinage was a sort of marriage, but without being given the name of marriage. And of course, there is a very crucial difference here in that the woman, as a slave, did not have the right to consent. Now, of course, one can mention the ideals and say that, okay, we can count on the good spirits of the Muslims at the time to make sure that she is being married to somebody that she is happy to be married to. So we can bring consent into play. We can imagine and expect that it must have been in the works and so on. But technically and legally, she did not have that right to consent. But all in all, when the practice in Muslim societies was compared with the practice outside of Muslim societies, one can see that there is a great advance in the rights of slaves in general in a Muslim society and the rights of concubines. And may I add just quickly to conclude that if the concubine bore a child for her master, then the child would be born free. And as opposed to some other contexts in which the child would continue to be regarded as a slave, like her mother is. And moreover, the woman now receives a special status in Muslim society. She's regarded as the mother of the child, walad in Arabic terms. And she could no longer be sold by the master to somebody else. And when the master dies, if he dies before her, she would be automatically free.
And the child could inherit as well.
And the child would inherit from the child's father, because this is a legitimate child to the father.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Shabir. I think next time we'll look at the harsher realities of the practice of concubinage.
Sure.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.